Okay, now you had Mark chapter 2 opened. Let's take a look at again. Let's keep it open, and thank you, Richard, for reading that. And we're going to be looking at this because this story is about a party crasher named Levi. We read in verse 14 again. As he, that is Jesus, walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. Now, think about this. Levi was the kind of guy that a good Jew never, ever invited to his party, okay? And you know why you never invited him to his party? Because he was a tax collector. Now, this last week, Friday actually, I got my taxes prepared for my tax preparer and put it in the mail on Saturday, and my tax preparer down south will work it over and he'll send it back to me, and then I will send it to a anonymous person in Fresno at the IRS office. Fresno. In America, the tax collectors don't have names. They just have cities and with an address that you send it to. And I don't even know the name of the person who's going to open the envelope and look at my situation. And the IRS is just this big, impersonal, scary government entity that wants my money every quarter. Now, I understand my money goes to help pay for roads. I use those roads. The police, I use the police from time to time, and all the other benefits that we have, street lights and so forth, and I appreciate our government. However, it is very difficult, as you know, to write that check to some impersonal being there. And I even have to hire a competent tax preparer who promises to go to court for me if I ever cross the IRS in the wrong way. Only I would cross them if I was unknowingly crossing them, you understand. But the tax collectors in Jesus' name in Jesus' time had real names, Jewish names that Jewish people knew. And what made paying taxes especially painful for Israel is that the taxes were being collected not for Jews, but for the hated Roman government. Well, that made Jewish tax collectors even more hated. They were seen as traitors to their country. And since the Jews thought that Israel was God's country, they saw themselves as these people as traitors to God. Now, would you invite a traitor to God to your party? Probably not. That's like the last person that you want to invite. Yet here we saw it. Richard read it to you. I just read it to you. You read it. You had a chance to look at Mark chapter 2. And Jesus is handing out an invitation to a hated Jewish traitor to join his party. Now, of all the people he could have invited, there were thousands of people that were coming to hear him speak. Couldn't he have picked one or two or something of people who were fishermen, another fisherman, or a janitor, or a mechanic, or a teacher? Why does he have to pick a tax collector of all people? What was he thinking? That's what I thought when I read that the first time. Now, look at verse 15. You have your Bible open. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many, that's more than one, tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. Then we look at 16. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, lump them all together, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" That's my question. Why is he eating there with this tax collector person? I think there's one answer as to why Jesus ate with sinners, and you know that answer. What have we been studying for the last couple of weeks? Go ahead and say it. What have we been studying? Jesus' creed, yes. That's it. It helps to explain his behavior. Love the Lord your God with all your being and your neighbor as yourself. Everything that he did came out of the Jesus Creed. So as we studied the Jesus Creed in previous weeks, we saw how loving God with our heart means to be passionately in love with God. If you've ever been in love, you know what passion is, right? You can't stop thinking about the one you love. If you have a passion for the Warriors, what are you thinking about right now? Basketball, what a night. But then after a while, that passion can wane, and it's always interesting to see what a win-loss record does to a person's passion. I've had a passion for the Oakland A's for a very long time. And if you have a passion for the A's for a long time, you have to do certain things during the year, during the season to cultivate that passion, because the general manager doesn't always help you out in that. But you can't stop thinking about what it is. So if you're a couple and you've kind of lost your passion, you need to get away and rekindle your passion. You need to court one another again, just like in the beginning days. In the same way, if our passion for God has started to wane, we need to get away. We need to get away and get alone with the Lord for an extended period of time and rekindle that relationship. But I'm too busy to do that. You're too busy not to do that. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how is your passion toward God right now? On a scale of 1 to 10, what is your passion for God? Compare it to what your passion to God was, say, a year ago or 5 years ago. Where's your passion right now, and what can you do about it? Now, the Jesus Creed says to love God with all of our soul. So I've been asking around, what is the soul? What do we say about the soul? In the culture of Israel, the heart, not your brain, was thought to be the place of your consciousness or your thinking. Follow me here, because I don't want you to lose this. The word translated as soul is nephesh. It refers to the life that is within us, so it should be regarded as a description of what makes us a conscious living being. So loving God with our soul means to have no other gods before us or allegiances in our life. God is a jealous God, and God doesn't want to share us with anyone. And here's where it becomes hard. Loving God with all of our soul becomes very difficult, because we put all kinds of things and pursuits before God. Turn on the television. What do you get on the television? About every few minutes, it seems like. A lot of commercials trying to sell you on doing something. Great car ads, great pill ads. I couldn't believe those Super Bowl ads. They just, wow. Even health stuff. Wow, it was amazing. And it's coming at us all the time. What if during the Super Bowl there came on an ad that said, love God with all of your being. Turn your heart to him and have a passion to serve him. Whoa, wouldn't that be something? But then the next one would be a Budweiser ad, and it would be forgotten. would wipe us out. But maybe you've heard the phrase, he sold his soul to the devil. That means we've put ourselves in a place where we're going to be thinking about someone or something more than God. Okay, so if somebody is sold their soul to the devil, let's say they've got a gambling problem, now they're deep in debt, they got to figure out how to get out of debt. What are they going to be thinking about all the time? They've sold their soul to the devil. And I think we do that a lot, and not even knowingly. So here's your next question. What do you think about most of the time? Is that what you want your thoughts to dwell on? Now, this is where it becomes a real problem for pastors and church workers, okay? Because we get it mixed up as to a passion thinking about God and thinking about church or thinking about ministry. We're like, well, I'm thinking about these things at church and these issues and these problems and how I'm going to make it better and blah, 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 blah. Wait a minute. Are you really focused on the Lord? Is that what your focus is on today? Or is it on church? Do not get the two mixed up. Church and God are not one and the same. Now, we get to loving God with our mind. I've been asked this several times since we started the Jesus Creed series. If you go back to Deuteronomy and the original prayer that Jesus adapted, the Shema, you will notice there that the Shema says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your strength. The mind is what Jesus added in there. So if you go to the Old Testament, you don't see the word mind. So I've been asked this a number of times. And I want to address that right here. But I don't want to lose you, okay? Because it's not complicated, but it may sound really boring to you. Okay, can you try to follow me here for a couple paragraphs? He added loving God with our mind when he modified the original Jewish Shema prayer in Deuteronomy, because the Old Testament that you and I have was originally written in Hebrew. It was translated to Greek as the culture was moving. And that was translated over 100 years before the time of Jesus. So the 72 Jewish scholars who translated the Hebrew into Greek chose words that reflected a Greek understanding in that day. Because of advances in science in that time, the Greeks had determined that the brain, not the heart, was the place of thinking. Remember, we had said that the heart was the place of thinking in the old Hebrew mind. And they referred to the mind, the dianoia. So, like its Hebrew counterpart, the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the original Hebrew, used the Greek term for the soul, psyche, plus a term giving emphasis, dunamis, power. So the Septuagint didn't change the basic meaning of the Hebrew text. It still conveyed wholeness and loving God with all that we are. When Jesus came along, about 150 years later, both the Hebrew and the Greek versions of the Old Testament were well known. Jesus blended the terms from the old Hebrew manuscript and the Greek translation, using the Hebraic concept of the thinking in the heart, the shared concept of the soul, and the Greek concept of thinking in the mind. That's why loving God with our mind is added to the Old Testament prayer that Jesus adopted. Just kind of a changing of the culture. Now, if that was totally unclear to you, I made 40 copies of my manuscript and I put them in the lobby out back there. There are 4 Jesus Creed groups this week, and you underline that, and you come in and you say, I didn't understand a word of what you said or wrote up there, okay? Basically this, Jesus was just being true to the Hebraic way of communication through repetition, similar to Hebrew poetry, where phrases are repeated with slight variations, but are simply used to give emphasis to a single concept. It's also reasonable to conclude that Jesus was trying to show that it doesn't matter if we think in the manner of a Jew or think in the manner of a Gentile, which sometimes was very, very different. We all need to love God with our thoughts. And all the while, he still retained the fundamental concept of loving God with all that we are. So Jesus, like Moses before him, called for a total, not a partial commitment to God. That's the kind of love that remains our calling today. Now, in Mark chapter 2, what he gave us was a demonstration of what he meant by loving God with our mind. And this is how it works. To invite a tax collector, someone that you totally despise, to your table, to your party, means you have to change your mindset that says tax collector types or whatever types you can't stand aren't welcomed here, okay? Now, after World War II, some American veterans came home from the war, and particularly those who served in the Pacific Theater, and they had a hard time loving or even accepting the Japanese. I didn't understand that. I didn't understand what that was all about and so forth. I met a number of them, and I've been a pastor to a number of them, and I didn't understand that until I read the book Unbroken and what was going on. If you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it or see the movie. Whenever they would see a Japanese person for years, it would remind them of the death of their friends in war at the hands of the Japanese. One such veteran that I knew personally was a Pearl Harbor survivor by the name of Alec Boatman. Boatman was a member of my church in Hemet, and he shared with me a testimony of for years and years, he just had a difficult time saying he loved God. And as we were doing the Jesus Creed, he back in 2010, he said that he had had a really hard time, and if he had heard this, and he had heard the Jesus Creed, of course, it's in the scriptures, back in the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, he would not have been able to live it at all, because he struggled with loving God with all this hatred he had toward the Japanese following the war. So he set out to do something about it. Instead of allowing that prejudice to become his God, he set out to write a book about his experiences in the hopes of finding some kind of relief. Well, as he began to write his memoirs and his experiences in the war, somebody challenged him. Why don't you try to find a Japanese counterpart who also fought in World War II against you? Maybe you weren't in combat against each other directly, but you were in the service. They were in the Japanese army and you were in the U.S. And so he started doing that, researching how we could find someone. And he found someone, and they sat down and he got the history of this person from the day this Japanese soldier was born and what his growing up was like, going to school, learning to read and so forth, through high school, what his hopes and dreams were in high school, and then with the start of the war. So he began to write about that experience that Japanese soldier had, and he was writing about his at the same time, and he realized that Japanese soldier wasn't much different than himself. They really were very, very similar. So they reconciled, and Alec was able to move on with his love for God. And his book, The Pacific Appointment, Two Lives That Met at Pearl Harbor, describes this. It's an amazing story. He's not the greatest writer, but it's a fascinating story in here of one way to deal with your anger, with your prejudice. By working on your mind, there are things that can be done. But if all the examples Jesus could have used, he used one of the most difficult to love for those people. The most difficult. You can say your neighbor is more difficult than this neighbor, yeah. But collectively, for the Jews, there were none worse than a tax collector. Because you understand what the tax collector was doing. If your taxes were $100 and that $100 went to Rome, he would charge you $120. $100 would go to Rome, and he would stick the rest in his pocket. He'd make $20 off his own people. He was a traitor. He truly was a traitor. And the Jewish leaders were certain that if Jesus was a genuine Jew, they'd be invited to his table. Not the tax collectors, right? They were invited, but they didn't want to come because they couldn't change their mind about the tax collectors. So my next question for you is, who is it that you need to change your mind about? Who is it that you really don't like? Who are my neighbors? In Jesus' mind, we love God and show that love by loving our neighbor. But some of us are going to ask, but that tax collector is not my neighbor. He lives in another town over. Right? He's in another different neighborhood. But we have all kinds of neighbors. You know, we have those waving neighbors. You know what those waving neighbors are? They're the kind that you don't know their name, you don't know where they work, you don't know their story. But you get in your car and you drive down the street and they're out in their yard, you go, hey. I don't know about condos, if you even see them in condos, but yeah, just a wave. We got a whole bunch of them in my neighborhood. Then occasionally and unfortunately, you may have the cursing neighbors. Oh, you know those kind of neighbors. Maybe you never had one. That is where you pull up and your neighbor is standing outside waiting for you, yelling at you because you brought a cat into the neighborhood and that cat's walking on top of your fence between her house and yours. Or the time I pulled up and I'm washing my car in my driveway and she's cursing me because I'm killing her grass. And I said, but I only use water on my car. Then there are the nosy neighbors. You know, every time you get out of your car, or go to your mailbox, or you going to mow your lawn, they're out there to talk to you. Oh, I see you got another car. You got somebody else living with you? Yes, that's Jesus' car right there. That's who I got living in my house. Then they go back in. You know, every time you drive to your house, you know they're watching your house. And you know that can be an advantage, but I'd rather rely on my dogs. Sometimes the nosy neighbor can become the obnoxious neighbor who always has advice for you. I'll never forget this one neighbor. I've been mowing my own lawn since I was 8. And here I was in my 40s, and I'm mowing the lawn, and he has to come outside and tell me the better way to mow my lawn. Like, in all these years, I know your method, I'm just choosing not to. Or the neighbor who has a dog that begins barking at 11 o'clock every single night. And you go over there and you say politely, please, can you put your dog to bed at night? And they do nothing, absolutely nothing. Obnoxious neighbor. Sometimes we get a best friend neighbor. We had one of those the last time we lived in San Jose, and we're still best friends. Our boys played together, and she and her husband would come over and so forth, and it was really good. But then we also had the mysterious neighbor, you know, where the guy never seems to leave his house, ever. Grass gets higher and higher. Open cat food cans littered across his walkway. Broken down hot tub sits in the front courtyard. Couple of broken down cars in the driveway. Old newspapers yellowing in the sun. What does he do in there? He's the mysterious neighbor. Over the years, Martha and I have had the big-time drug dealer, the ex-cop neighbor whose house was invaded by a SWAT team. We've had the party to 3 a.m. on a Saturday night neighbor, great for pastors, I tell you. There's the drunk neighbor, there's the needy neighbor, there's the dangerous neighbor, there's the sick neighbor, there's the lonely neighbor, there's the quiet neighbor. That's what I have right now. I love my neighbors in my neighborhood. They're really good. Maybe you don't have neighbors like I have right now, but maybe you have neighbors that you, other people that you run into. So you know whom God gives to me? On Monday mornings, I come for a couple hours as a chaplain in our breakfast program. And let me tell you, some of those guys in there can be as obnoxious as possible with me. If they're having a bad day, they're going to try to help me have a bad day as well. And I wonder how hard it is. Why? You know, we have a couple of choices with people we don't like. We can write them off, and I'm never going to see them. I'm going to ignore them. I got a garage door opener. I'm going to go straight into my house, and I'm never going out in the front yard again. Okay? There's that way of doing it. Well, we can ask ourselves this question. Why did God bring that person into my life in the first place? Maybe God brought that obnoxious neighbor into my life to increase my love for God. Now, if that sounds backwards to you, I think it really is. In the Jesus Creed, loving your neighbor is proof that you have love for God, right? As long as we only consider our friends whom we like as our neighbors, then it's quite easy to love our neighbors. See, God, I do love you. I really do love my neighbors. And truly, if the people that live around my house right now were it, I could really prove that I love God a lot because they're wonderful people. We love our friends because our friends give us something in return that we like friendship. But obnoxious neighbors give us something else, headaches. So how does an obnoxious neighbor increase our love for God? You see, the more we love God, the more we will love ourselves. And the more you love yourself, the more you will love your neighbor. Then you will see your neighbor, the person driving by you with the booming radio on, cutting you off on the freeway, blah, blah, blah. You will see those neighbors more the way Jesus sees those neighbors. In Mark chapter 2, verse 17, we read, on hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy." He's referring to those the Pharisees who were asking, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." See, loving God with all of your mind means you have to do something about all those prejudices that have crept into your life, during your life. We have to do something about the stereotypes we have of people we don't like. We have to reprogram the mind. And not everyone we meet is going to be our friend, but they don't have to be excluded from our life. And the way we reprogram our mind is to see people like God sees people, sinners in God's help. So that's what I want you to do this week, and our groups are going to be working on this. And I urge you, if you're in the Jesus Creed group, I've got, I think it's 7 questions in there, 7 questions. They can be answered from this manuscript. Go through and answer them. Write them out. Write out your answers on there, and we're going to go more in depth into it. But this is what I want you to think about this week. There are people that you don't get along with, that you don't like. I've never met anyone that didn't have someone in their life like that. This is what I want you to do for them and for yourself. I want you to list out their names, and for this week, pray for them by name. Say their name before the Lord and pause, and then say the name of the next person. Now, I suspect that you have maybe a dozen people at most that could be on that list. So that won't take very long. But some of you who may be having some difficulty with people, and you may have 50 or 60, but I hope not. It may be a race of people that you're struggling with. I hear prejudice all the time, all over, even in this very multi-ethnic area. If it is a race of people that you are struggling with, I want you to pray for those folks, for that group of people, for the gospel to spread amongst them, for the love of Christ for them to experience, for you to see the beauty and advantage, because everyone is made in the image of God, regardless of where they have come from in the past, regardless of where they were born, regardless who they were born to. But this is making a decision in my mind that I am going to do something this week to pray for those people that I have a problem with. Love God with all of your mind, and then your neighbor as yourself.